Bonjour, donc nous allons commencer.
So good morning. We're about to start. We are
Attendions les retardataires.
starting a bit late.
En début de matinée.
Other people are going to join us very soon.
J'espère va vous.
I hope that you'll be interested in the topic we're going to cover this morning.
Qui, permet de
It's a
voir
session that is useful because it opens up new pathways in the way you can understand addictive pathways and strategies. Pierre-Michel, I teach psychiatry. I was involved in the management of addiction. I've been doing this for many years. I'm based in Clermont-Ferrand, and I'm pleased to invite two speakers. They have a common trait in terms of developmental approach, development of the brain. They have insights that enables us to better understand the emergence of disorders, and both of them will deal with the same topic from different perspectives. We'll start with Jean-Luc Martinot.
Jean-Luc Martinot.
Jean-Luc Martinot, who is Director of Research at INSERM. He works in a research unit entitled Developmental Psychiatric Trajectory in Imaging. He's been dealing with imaging for many years, as he could tell us about imaging that are very useful, especially in young people. Because it helps you better understand the mechanism of addictions, among other mechanisms. He's also a child psychiatrist. Thank you very much, Jean-Luc. You have 1 hour and a half, so you have 25 minutes each, and then we're having Q&A session.
As we are in Paris, I switch to French, but my slides are in English. So, merci aux assistants.
I'd like to thank the assistants and those who work for the Congress, because they were a great assistance. I'd like to tell you about development addiction imaging, highlighting the fact that we need models in order to be able to interpret the data. I'll illustrate this fact when I deal with brain scars, moderators or new moderators, or again, issues of resilience.
Alors, un résultat récent.
The recent result of the mental imaging shows that if you deal or investigate the structure of the brain, that is to say, the volume of the various parts of the brain, you'll be able to realize that this is not fixed. It varies with age in one's lifetime, especially in the cortical part of the brain. They decrease during infancy and adolescence, while those parts who are below the cortex, the white matter, will increase until 20 or 25 years of age. And then it's the opposite. One sees a decrease in the volumes of these two main parts of the brain. And you can also take more accurate measures or measurements in more central parts of the brain, amygdala, hippocampus, which take a part in emotions and memory, or again, some parts of the gray nucleus. So, and to achieve this, we've collected data from 2,500 individuals, which were collected and then analyzed with the same software. So this enables you to calculate the differences according to the T1 minus T2, the difference, the change, as a function of age, and you can draw curves showing changes
différentes parties du cerveau.
that occur in various parts of the brain. So this is a kind of a new norm, a new standard, which is being set up, and a number of labs are working on that basis, on that approach. Now, it's very rich of information in the central part, much fewer information concerning the cortex. Only a few subcortical regions are measured. Why is that? Perhaps it has to do with the method itself, the way in which one measures volumes. The system transforms the surface of the brain into many different triangles, and you measure those triangles. So it's all quantified. Now, according to the size, so you have to repeat the process over and over again to get a stable measure. According to the size of recursions, the complexity of the cortex may be better understood. If there are not enough recursions, of course, there's not possible to measure anything in the cortex, or no fine measurement. Now, the problem is that the number of recursion is high. The calculation power required is necessary. So if you measure 15,000 individuals, of course, it wasn't possible to do this. And this is the answer to the unasked question: why is it this study can measure simple structures in terms of their form subcortically, even though it remains difficult to understand the difficult geography of these subcortical areas. I'll be referring to many questions of several. The first one, brain damage or brain scars occurring in addicts. In a series of studies initiated by André Félix a long time ago, followed by Michel, Reinout, and taken over by Paul Brousse, friends, Laurent Carilla, Beniamina, Catherine Martelly, Paul Brousse, were able to see that in type A, alcohol addicts, that is without any complication, organic complications, who function well in societies, that a decrease in the quantity of grey matter, quite significant. The maximum dimension measured that was minus 25% of the signal. So we wonder at the time whether it has anything to do with the quantity of alcohol. There was no relationship whatsoever, except for one fact, the age when that individual started drinking or binge drinking. It starts with adolescence. So, hence the relevance of adolescence. Now, in terms of white matter, alterations were found where the signal is clearer. It's easier to measure statistically in relation with the found with the performances achieved in certain cognitive tests.
Alors, une question qui se posait, c'était est-ce qu'il y a une certaine réversibilité
is there a reversibility of these changes? I'm referring to Catherine Martelly's study. She followed the same individuals for 7 years. I showed pictures of those persons earlier, using exactly the same equipment for scanning purposes and taking the same measurements. Of course, there are much fewer individuals at the outcome. The results are quite clear. After 7 years, relapses, as the volume of grey matter continues going down and the volume of white matter goes down, at the same time, while in control patients as well as in abstainers, it's the opposite. There is an increase in volume of grey matter, and the volume are compatible to the initial situation, which is good news because it goes to show that abstinence or abstention is a good way to recover from the alterations created by alcohol absorption. Now, looking at the relationship between imaging and the moderators or determinants of brain changes, one sees that it's a complex system with a huge number of co-variables that you need to take into account. One way you can this is follow individuals over time, follow them up. Big data is the outcome because you have to measure many data and many variables, and in order to analyze big data, of course, you need proper models. So, how do you constitute a cohort? First, you can standardize the method used to acquire data in various European centers. This is why we asked a number of centers in order to have the adequate number of patients, and we used different measurements coming from different angles, different disciplines. According to epidemiology, the cohort was used on the general population. Adolescents and their parents were recruited in colleges or at the age of 14. Psychometric methods were used, essentially online method. The adolescents would reply from home. High field imaging, standardized as to the sequences as well as genomics, acquired during almost 10 years. And more recently, we also acquired data during the COVID crisis. So the consortium created the first multidisciplinary cohort in the world in this population, adolescents from the community. So we're able to store data. You see the age brackets from 14 years of age to 25, close to 26, and we are currently busy analyzing the data. More than 2,000 adolescents were examined at 14 years, and 1,200 were followed up 10 years down the road. So it gives you an idea of the attrition. When you start such a study, and we stood a smaller group to investigate the psychological reaction to being locked down. So a few examples. The first example, the link between cannabis use and the thinning of the cortex between 14 and 19 years of age. You see that there is a distinction can be made between the share, as it were, that is due to the normal thinning, which is a natural phenomenon during adolescence, the part coming from cannabis use, and the thinning, in fact, was proportional to the intensity of the cannabis use. So it was interesting because we were able to show that there was a correspondence with the B1 cannabinoid receptors location. So this is a good way to investigate on the damage created by consuming drugs, cannabis, during adolescence.
deuxième aspect, les
Second
scars,
part,
on va dire les séquelles. Est-ce qu'il y a des
brain scars or brain sequelae from addiction.
étudier ça?
So one possible approach
D'un modèle
is to use a cognitive
qu'il est convenu
model,
système de récompense, hein, qui intègre
what is typically called the reward system.
une tâche
So the task we investigated is the Knusten test
des régions cérébrales pendant
that engages brain regions during a functional MRI.
et le suivant.
The principle
On présente
goes like this.
l'IRM,
You show an index.
lui indiquer s'il y a
The index tells you whether a triangle is going to earn any point,
de l'expérience ou qui
some points, or a lot of points.
pense dans la
In other words, a very high reward later on in the experiment. And then he clicks on the button to see on which side the square appears, and then the feedback tells you how many points have been earned.
d'indissage
So it's an indexing system
qui correspond à la phase d'anticipation.
that corresponds to the anticipation phase.
L'anticipation de la récompense, c'est quand on fait
Indexing
la voix
and action.
physiquement, il y a même une sorte de buzz
Physically,
qu'on sent physiquement.
a kind of burst is felt because you're concentrating resources in order to pay attention because you want to win something.
On se rend pas compte quand on regarde juste les
Now, if you just look at the slides, you see that it's almost a physical sensation that you get, and then there's a feedback.
Donc cette
Loop.
tâche a pu étudier
So the task
les différences entre les régions activées
was used to study the differences between in the regions activated between 14 and 19 years of age. Interesting results.
certaines régions
As you see that in some regions,
d'activation
activation increases between 14 and 19 years of age.
essentiellement réparties
They are essentially distributed over the cortex, that is the surface of the brain, while other regions, on the contrary, decrease in terms of activity.
il y a une bonne partie
Between 14 and 19 years of age, parts of the regions we are at the core of the brain, the classical reward regions
en fait
are involved.
il y a beaucoup de régions
But in fact, there are many regions or areas in the cortex
cette
where the activity decreases. This is a reward system. This is something one often reads in literature.
ventral
The ventral striatum did this or that, or reacted this way and that way, and the drug act on the ventral striatum, etc. In fact, the reward system engages far more areas than currently stated in literature.
Donc évidemment, les questions qui se posent, c'est comment ce pattern développemental
So, what about this developmental
altéré par
pattern?
l'alcool et là, en
How
l'occurrence
can it be altered by the use of alcohol? There might be an interaction between alcohol and developmental changes in the way in which the brain operates, not in the brain structure, but it's the way it operates.
le modèle en essayant de rajouter de la biochimie,
On a more complex level, you can
de modèle bio,
go for a biochemistry, biocognitive,
la disponibilité
to try and see whether the availability of dopamine transmitter is related to the reaction that you observe.
en fait
We did this
aux amis de Paul Brousse.
with our friends at Paul Brousse
Il s'agissait donc
Hospital.
mêler cette tâche,
So combining these tasks
pendant cette tâche à celle faite,
with the acquisition coming from functional MRI.
vous voyez qu'on a cherché,
And you see,
on a mis ensemble deux
we've
modes de mesure
put together two modes of measurement of the reward system. This is what we refer to multimodal imaging, to show that in some areas
dans lesquels le signal
the signal
corrélé.
is correlated.
Dans certaines
In particular, in some areas
qui sont des régions classiques
which are traditional regions or areas in the reward system. As you see, it's much larger than these specific regions. So we look at the correlations.
des cocaïnomanes, des schizophrènes.
In cocaine individuals, healthy or depressed
Finalement, la corrélation était
individuals, and we found a very similar correlation.
Du groupe diagnostic, c'est-à-dire que là, il y a
It doesn't make a difference. In other words, we found the same mechanism, which is that the transport of dopamine is correlated to the activity induced by the task, and this is regardless of the diagnosis.
qui est conservé.
So the same physiological picture is found
Les groupes pathologiques. Donc,
in all groups.
en l'occurrence, la prise de drogue.
So using drugs does not induce any sequelae on this part of the dopaminergic system. That's the transport. Doesn't mean that in other fields no alterations will be found.
Suivante.
Next,
D'autres collègues du consortium ont étudié
some colleagues in the consortium investigated sequelae in adolescents whose mother smoked
la grossesse.
during she was pregnant, during her pregnancy. So 40 years down the road, they tried to find
Les sous-groupes
a relationship between subgroups of adolescents
en fonction du degré d'intoxication de la mère pendant la grossesse.
according to the quantity of smoke
Fait que ceux qui étaient
inhaled.
exposés
Those who are highly exposed to smoking see the capacity of the central part of the dopaminergic system
effectivement dopamine
is indeed affected. I'm referring to the reward system.
une anticipation,
So,
une réponse à l'anticipation
response to anticipation
qui a été autant
tend to be lower
dans leur
in patients who are highly exposed during their adolescence. So you can refer to functional sequelae.
presque parler de
You can also refer to biochemical mistreatment, because the intoxication occurs during the very sensitive period in the growth of the brain. I'm referring to pregnancy, where the brain is extremely plastic
éminemment vulnérable.
and particularly vulnerable.
On a repris aussi, on a réussi à rechercher
We also looked for sequelae in patients who were 14 years
pour chercher,
at the time,
regarder si ceux qui
to
sont
try and see
heavy drink,
whether who are so-called heavy drinkers,
s'il y avait des anomalies
whether anomalies were to be found
blanches dans le
in white fibers
tronc cérébral et là
of the stem,
où se trouvent les noyaux
brain stem, because that's where the original nuclear
pour aller se projeter vers le système.
of the threads that would project into the reward system are to be found. And measurements show that there is a decrease
Du nombre de fibres
in the number of fibers that are created in the brainstem that are projected towards the nucleus of the reward system. So this is the second vulnerable period,
aussi
adolescence.
éminemment vulnérables à la prise de
And during that time,
structure cérébrale
drinking alcohol can be extremely
mais du fonctionnement.
detrimental. Structurally, not just in terms of
D'autres types de questions
development.
se posent. Alors, est-ce qu'il est possible de
Now,
trouver de
what about
nouveaux modérateurs
new moderators, transition to addiction or predictors of addiction?
Là, on a retour à des techniques
So
qui sont dérivées de la statistique,
we used
qui sont des techniques d'apprentissage,
techniques derived from the statistical study.
l'intelligence artificielle.
This is what they like to call artificial intelligence. In fact, there are mere algorithms,
Calcul, si on veut.
calculations formulae.
Exemple
In
d'algorithme,
other words, this is an example.
ElasticNet,
An elastic net, it's the name of this algorithm, which is useful because we try to predict potential problem using this method. The main problem is that you want to have high quality of prediction. The level of prediction has to be high enough. So this system is useful and reliable because the learning can be modulated by a control of some biases to reduce variation and increase the quality, enhance the quality of training. And another virtue of this system is that it ignores redundant co-variables. It doesn't take them into account. As a matter of fact, it does reduce the number of core variables to the minimum. So the principle is that the system learns how to identify individuals in subgroups drawn from random groups, and then is supposed to apply the rules on what remains in the subgroup. This is why you need such a high number of individuals. Now, the main results achieved with this approach was a new moderator, a predictive model that enables you to predict how much alcohol they will drink when they reach the age of 16, the basis being the basic age being 14. So you see there are a number of bubbles, variables that become more and more important. The size of the bubble tells you how much weight the variable has. So it has to do with a past history of the person. They come first. Then you have other smaller variables which have to do with the personality of the individual, and then bubbles or measurements related to brain imaging, the history of the person, and genetics come much later, or the role of genetics is much lighter, much smaller. So the main relevance of this kind of approach is that it enables you to show that vulnerability to addiction may be related to a number of moderators or predictors that you can rank in terms of importance, which shows that no single biomarker can account for the risk of switching to a real disorder. And I think that this is an example for many disorders, a majority of mental disorders.
Finally, I'm going to talk about resilience and the potential of this approach with an algorithm. With Catherine Martelly, we decided to try and look whether the brain volume measurements in a teenager was different between those who were able to spontaneously stop a multiple addiction. So we compared the various groups. We compared between the group that spontaneously stopped the drugs they took at 14. When we checked at 19, they were no longer consuming, and we compared them to those who continued with the intoxication. And we noted there was a number of very specific regions that that define the singular cortex that were involved. And when we compared at the age of 14 with the age of 14, we saw that there had already been an increase in the volume of the singular region in those who were going to spontaneously stop their addiction later on. So this is based on a group comparison. Can we manage to classify individuals? That is a question. So in order to do that, we looked at another algorithm, the random forest algorithm, the idea being to create a large number of decision trees based on the various measurements you enter into the system. And you start from the premise that there will be different potential relationships between the various measurements. Obviously, the more decision trees you have, the more reliable. And the advantage of it is that you avoid redundancies or overfitting, and it's quite easy to explain how the model works. In as much as, provided the tree is not too complicated, because when the tree becomes overly complex, then there's no miracle, it will not work. On the next slide, it's not working anymore, so I'm going to ask you to switch to the next slide, please. Thank you.
Merci. On voit qu'il est possible de
As you can see, we can classify individually adolescents that have spontaneously stopped using substances. And there's about 12 measurements that enable us to spot the adolescents that will be in this case. You have psychometric variables.
Et puis, des variables, justement, les mesures du cortex.
Like openness to experience and variables from the cingulate and measurements of white matter.
Mais on voit que quand on fait...
Nevertheless, when you have this type of approach,
en fait, il y a toujours une...
you realize that there's always a dialectics issue between the use of quite rudimentary methods or complex algorithms. We tend to complicate algorithms and methods and end up with a complicated system.
Ici, les arbres de décision et la régression de risque de l'assaut.
I've given you several examples.
Incomplète de l'ensemble.
Here you have an incomplete view of the methods that can be used by what is called artificial intelligence.
Donc, en conclusion,
by way of conclusion,
on peut acquérir des...
I believe that one can acquire new info on addictions and brain scars, moderators, and resilience via longitudinal studies.
Les données,
Nevertheless,
ne parlent pas par
the data do not speak for themselves. They're not self-explanatory, and you need a model to be able to interpret them properly.
Les algorithmes, donc...
As concerns algorithms that are very much talked about at present, the interesting thing is they can be used as a precaution against confirmation biases. You know, when the researcher tends to want to confirm his or her hypothesis and has a priori beliefs about data or preconceived ideas. So the idea would be to design new models to incorporate the huge number of covariables and be able to control them And it's important to know that there is no real gold standard at present, meaning that we constantly need a feedback between the specialists in AI and the people who produce the data in order to model the data sets. So the team where I work has integrated a team of mathematicians in order to validate the setting of new models and extract knowledge from it. And obviously this multidisciplinary team is open to collaborations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci Jean-Luc. On va enchaîner directement.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Luc. We're going to continue right away with the presentation by Reinout Wiers. He is a professor of developmental psychopathology in the University of Amsterdam. He worked on implicit models that enable to understand behaviors and to develop intervention strategies. He publishes a lot in Addiction magazine, and I would like to give him the floor. Well, first of all, let me thank Amin and Pedro for inviting me.
I think it's better for all of us if I continue in English. Yes, so I will also talk about development, but basically about the other side. So as we saw in the previous talk, taking drugs and alcohol is not good for the health of your brain. Probably you are all aware of this, but there's fantastic new research coming out of the Imagen and other big data sets. Now the question is, a lot of people do get addicted, as we all know as well. So can we also help people to develop their brains in a more healthy way on the way back to recovery? And that will be the focus of my talk. I'll talk about retraining neurocognitive biases, and then also about clinical effectiveness, and actually a whole series of clinical trials, and the last one is explicitly about dual diagnosis as well. So does it work better or worse for people with an alcohol problem, and on top of it also either anxiety or depression? Then I'll talk a little bit about neurocognitive mechanisms, so you do get some imaging slides, and then some new developments. Okay, let's first go to a taxonomy. So there are a lot of different types of training around that are used to help people recover from addictions, mostly alcohol, but actually also for some other addictions. There's a big split here, and that there's a very simple rule to find out what type of training you're looking at, and that is, are there substance-related or addiction-relevant cues involved? If yes, what you're trying to train is the relatively automatic responses to the cue that typically lead to the drug taking. If no, there can also be general cognitive functions like working memory, inhibition, that you might want to train in order to help people to recover from addiction. I will talk about this side, cognitive bias modification. A brief word on the other side. There's interesting stuff going on. The problem is generalization. So typically what you find is people get better, for example, on a working memory task, say alcohol-dependent patients, but it doesn't really generalize to making them also more successful in remaining abstinent. So that's why maybe getting these addiction-relevant cues in the training might be more efficient. We'll have a look. So within the cognitive bias modification, I'll talk about two general types. One is attentional bias retraining, and then one is approach bias retraining. There's also other types, but my time is not endless. So first, what are these cognitive biases in addiction? So you can distinguish attention. Where does your attention focus? You can look at memory biases. What is your first association if you see a picture like this? And you have action tendency, so a spontaneously activated first tendency to either approach or avoid. Now this is anecdotal. We'll have a look how you measure that and how you can also maybe change that. So on the attentional bias side, this is one example test often used. It's the dot probe test. And you see two pictures, and then behind one of the two, you will see one or two dots. And that's what you indicate when you're the participant. Now, if you use this task as a measurement tool, obviously, half of the time the dots are behind the alcohol, half of the time behind the non-alcohol, and you look at the reaction time differences and error pattern to determine if someone has an attentional bias. It's actually not the best task to measure it. But what's interesting, you can actually change the task basically without any notification, because people do the same thing, react to the dots, and then, for example, train people away from alcohol by placing all the dots behind the non-alcohol. Or, if you want to look at causality in non-dependent people, you can also place them behind the alcohol pictures and see if they like to drink more afterwards. That has been done, say, 10, 15 years ago in a couple of studies in our own lab and a couple of studies in Liverpool. And basically the pattern of results is, yes, you can change this attentional bias, but like the general training, it doesn't generalize. So if you have novel alcohol stimuli, you still see attention-grabbing qualities. And also no consistent effects on behavior. But this is single session in students who come in for reward, course credit, not to change their behavior. So then we thought, well, what if we take this actually to the clinic? So this was the first small randomized control trial in alcohol-dependent patients, where we had 21 patients who were trained 5 sessions with novel stimuli all the time away from alcohol. And we had another group also in treatment for alcohol dependence that were not trained, but they saw the exact same pictures in an irrelevant task. But they actually got the same motivating feedback. Yes, you're getting better, you're getting faster, etc. What are the results? Well, now we do see a generalized effect on the attentional bias. If this is a positive value, you have an attentional bias for alcohol. So what you see in the control group, that it actually increases. The same had also been observed in people who don't do any training. And even though this is a small study, we saw the same thing in a very big study I'll show in a minute. So it seems if you don't do anything, people are in a clinic, but their attentional bias actually increases. Not good, because then you're out of the clinic and you see alcohol everywhere. But you can train it, and then what you see is you get a negative attentional bias. So that means your first response will be to avoid the alcohol rather than to approach it with your attention. And that actually also helped in remaining abstinent. Small study, but promising effects. And we'll get back to attentional bias in a bit. Then we go to the other bias, that's approach bias. So here we use this fancy apparatus, a joystick, harder and harder to get. We let people react to the format of a picture. It can be either landscape or portrait. And when you pull the joystick, then you have a feeling of approach. And when you push it, you have a feeling of avoidance. So first let's look at assessment. These are heavy drinking students, which you see there's an approach bias, and it's actually moderated by the OPERM1 gene. So heavy drinkers have a tendency to approach alcohol, especially if they have the OPERM1 G allele. Light drinkers actually have a tendency to avoid, which is probably handy in a society where there's a lot of push to drink. So that was promising. Then we thought, well, maybe we can also change it. So again, we first go to students, proof of principle study. We took hazardously drinking students, so not people who really had an alcohol problem. And then they were randomly allocated to either approach or avoid most of the alcohol after a brief assessment phase. And we found strong generalized effects. Untrained pictures, a different task using words, and also the heavy drinkers who had been trained to avoid alcohol drank less beer in the taste test afterwards. So that was actually quite promising if you compare it to the proof of principle attentional bias studies. So we decided to take this one to a first collaboration with a big German clinic. And now we have 214 alcohol-dependent patients that were either trained to avoid alcohol in the same task, 4 sessions, either with or without explanation, or they had assessment control, so equally often push and pull or no training at all. There were no differences between the 2 versions of training or the 2 control groups. Here is this other task that uses words. So here you sort alcohol words with approach words or avoid words. And in another phase, alcohol words with avoid words. And what you see is that on average, the patients are faster to sort alcohol words with approach words. Now remember, these are people in a clinic who want to quit drinking. But still, the automatic pilot takes them to the alcohol. If you don't train, doesn't matter if you do just assessment or nothing at all, doesn't change. But you can change it by this targeted training, and now you see avoidance associations. So that's hopeful. But of course, the most important thing is what happens concerning relapse. Now, nicely, this clinic has a standard assessment 1 year after treatment discharge. So this is actually almost 14 months after 4 sessions of training. And you see that if you get this training on top of your regular treatment, the chance that you relapse decreases. So that's nice. We did a big replication study in the same clinic, more than 500 people. And what you see now is, again, later or less relapse a year later, 9% less, and also mediation by the change in this automatic alcohol approach bias. And also moderated mediation, which means that especially those patients with a strong approach tendency profit from this additional training on top of their regular therapy. It's not a replacement, it's an add-on. So that's all promising. Then the first meta-analysis came out, and it concluded that there are effects on bias, but they don't translate to clinical outcomes. So that was strange, because we actually did the clinical study, so we thought, how can you conclude this if all clinical studies show positive effects? Well, the problem here was that basically they combined these different types of studies. So there had been a lot of proof of principle studies where students are trained, sometimes toward alcohol, because you want to test the causality of the bias. And yes, they drink more if you're successful. But these are students who come in for free beer or course credit, or because they have to, they don't want to change their behavior. So you get a small temporary effect if the bias is changed. But of course, this is not a sample where you can test clinical effects. If you look at the clinical RCTs, there's a consistent add-on effect of around 10% less relapse if you add training to the regular treatment. Then there's this middle section that are online RCTs. So they're a bit different because they're not patients, but they typically do have a problem. They're not so much rewarded other than for free training. So they are motivated to change their behavior, but they have a different goal. They want to reduce their drinking. Hardly anyone wants to fully quit, and they do. But here, it doesn't matter whether they get the real training or sham training. So you get a non-specific time effect. Whereas here, if you add it to treatment, you do get a differential effect. around 10% less relapse. So we decided to do a meta-analysis of only the clinical studies, and we replicated that there is a small effect on the bias and on relapse. However, there is no significant effect on use. That is, in the difference between real training and sham training, because of these internet trials where abstinence was not the goal. Okay. So what is the last state of affair? There are now 3 large clinical trials that have been published since this trial. The first one combined the 2 types of training that I just showed to you. So people either got 6 sessions of this approach bias training or 6 sessions of attentional bias retraining, remember with the dots, or a bit of both, 3 sessions of each, or any of the corresponding placebo training, or nothing. And what do we see a year later? It doesn't matter which variety of training you get, but you do better than if you don't get training or get sham training, again, around 9%. Then there's this study that came out this year in JAMA Psychiatry, where they did the same thing in Australia. One difference was that they did it during withdrawal. Again, 12% less relapse if you add training to withdrawal versus no training in this case. And they suggest that it should now really be implemented as an add-on to treatment. And that's what happened now. It's in the guidelines, both in Germany, where these first large trials took place, and in Australia, where this one took place. So maybe interesting for France as well. And then there's the last trial, which was actually specifically looking at dual diagnosis. So again, on average, we saw 10% less relapse if you get approach bias training on top of your regular treatment. But now we specifically looked, does it make a difference whether people have a comorbid internalizing disorder? And the answer was yes. And it's positive news, because the better effects was for the patients with the comorbid internalizing problems. That's where most of the action is. Whereas we know that for other treatments, they might be difficult. So this seems really a very good idea to add to this type of patient. If we compare to medication, effect size is about the same. So if you look at meta-analysis for acamprosate and naltrexone, you get a number needed to treat of 12. For CBM versus treatment or versus sham training, it's around 10. So it's in a similar order of magnitude. Small effects, we're not there yet. It does help, but it helps about 10% of the patients to not relapse who would otherwise have relapsed. So that's nice. But again, room for improvement, and let's have a brief look at what happens in the brain when you train. So here we have Corinne de Wiers. This is actually a far cousin of mine who independently went to alcohol research and did her PhD in Berlin with the group with Andreas Heinz and Henrik Walter, Felix Bernpol. And basically, she scanned people before the training, either the real training or sham training, and looked at cue reactivity in the scanner and looked at what happens to this cue reactivity to alcohol cues if you do CBM or if you get placebo training. And what you see is that the reactivity in the amygdala, it's significant. Nucleus accumbens was borderline. So in well-known circuits responding to reward cues, the reactivity goes down more strongly in the CBM group than in the placebo group. And you also get more reactivity for the alternative, so the non-alcoholic drinks. She also ingeniously put people in the scanner in an approach avoidance task, obviously now a joystick without metal, and found effects on the medial prefrontal cortex. And those reductions correlated with the reductions in the approach bias scores. And actually, to my surprise, she actually did find the approach bias in the scanner, even though the group was, of course, relatively small. So finally, some words on new developments. Based on some novel theoretical insights from basic experimental cognitive psychology concerning this training, mostly done by Pieter van Dessel from Ghent University, we changed to a new variety called ABC training. And I'll explain you why it's called ABC in a minute. So the theoretical background, we know it's effective, but not in online trials. And what he showed in a series of proof of principle studies in students is that it might actually work through influencing automatic inferences rather than associations. And some of the findings here, he found that awareness of the implications of the consequences is needed to get a training effect. And you could also get some training effects just by instructions, which really go against the idea that this is based on changing associations. It's actually related to the general notion now of the predictive brain. So we're constantly predicting whatever happens next and trying to figure out means to influence whatever happens next, and drinking could be one way to do that. So what you want to train is that people find other ways to influence whatever happens next. So ABC, why ABC? Well, we thought, well, this is about an antecedent or a risk situation. I think it's the same in French, antécédent, which is, of course, a known trigger for relapse situations. And there, you always have a behavioral choice. Now, in the heat of the moment, you come home stressed, you're used to taking a drink, that's what you're going to do. But you might want to think, here we actually have an example with smoking, of alternatives. And then you want to prepare these alternatives, very much like what you do in CBT. But then you also get consequences for specific goals that are relevant to you as a patient. So this could be long-term health, but it could also be money, other things, whatever you want to do. And then you do this with an avatar. So you choose your own guy or woman who represents you, and then you do the training. So as we found that this type of training, the CBM training, adds to regular therapy, we thought this more specific variety might actually maybe even help better. So this is how it looks. You choose your avatar, and then you get a situation. I feel stressed. You can either drink, take a walk, and if you choose to take a walk, your own goal goes up. So we start this with a forced choice variety, where you learn both consequences. Then you get the open choice with your consequences, so you can think about what you do, and then you get this. But then you get it in a speeded fashion, so very fast. And this is to foster automatization of the alternative behavior. There's no published papers yet on the results. I did publish the idea, as you saw, and we have some promising initial findings. If we have more time, I can show you some of these. But now I go to conclusions. Many times replicated now an add-on effect of cognitive training of around 10%, less relapse a year later. There's 6 big randomized controlled trials that show this effect. It's now recommended in the clinical guidelines in Australia and Germany. The most recent study showed that the effect was actually bigger for people with a comorbid internalizing problem. So I think especially relevant for these patients, which could also be used for this new ABC training, because some of the antecedents will be related to their negative effect, of course. So maybe even more important to try to think of personalized alternatives and train these. Because, of course, that's the weak side of cognitive behavior therapy, that, you got to do your homework. And like kids in school, that's not the best part. It's not effective as a standalone intervention, so don't walk away from this and think, okay, my students drink too much, I'll just give them this training. Doesn't make a difference. We did several studies showing that. On neural effects, my far cousin showed nice first effects basically on cue reactivity. And there's a new variety based on new insights, the ABC training. So that's the short journey on cognitive training and the latest updates. So development after people became dependent. I think we have some time for questions, right? For both of us.
So we will have questions. Thank you very much.
Merci infiniment.
Donc nous avons une douzaine de minutes pour...
We have approximately 12 minutes for questions and answers. Are there any questions from the floor for both presentations, obviously? Jean-Luc Martinot and Arnaud de Wiers.
Alors moi, I have a first question for Reinout Wiers. I would like to know, you show a meta-analysis, and in this meta-analysis it was alcohol and tobacco. The meta-analysis about the impact of the approach bias, and your meta-analysis, and it was alcohol and tobacco. I would like to know if there's a difference between alcohol and tobacco in terms of results, and have you used this kind of approach in other kind of addiction?
Yes.
C'est juste, tout le monde a compris, je pense, ce que j'ai dit.
Well, I think that everybody understood what I said, but I'll repeat my question. He's shown meta-analysis on alcohol and tobacco, and I wanted to know whether there were any differences and whether the approach, the add-on approach, was also observed in other addictions.
So, in both meta-analysis, there was not enough power to look at it, but if you just look at the effects and also at the further effects, so the last 3 big RCTs in alcohol again were significant with around 10% less relapse. In smoking, the pattern is way more varied, but this was actually one of the, say, seeds for changing from CBM to ABC, and that was the B. Because with alcohol, you have a natural alternative. Every social meeting you go to in the Netherlands, but surely also here in Paris, you have this choice between alcohol or something like this. So if we put in these non-alcoholic drinks, totally relevant for all people. But what is not smoking? It's basically a philosophical question, right? So it can be anything. But typically, in most of the training methods, what people used was based on the assessment. So then, you have a picture of someone holding a cigarette, and then the control will be someone holding a pen. Now, this alternative is obviously way less relevant than the water. So you're just trained away from the cigarettes, but not to a meaningful alternative. So that's when we did a first study, actually in depressed smokers who needed basically a relevant alternative to smoking when they were feeling down, negative effect. So for one person, it could be take a walk. The next person, it can be go gardening. The third person, it can be call a friend or something. But, for the call a friend person, gardening is like the last thing he or she wants to do. So it's really important that these are personalized. So this is where the personalized Bs came in. And that actually, and now in 2 studies, we showed it works better than the original training. And then when you add consequences, you get more of the inferential approach. So we are hopeful that we might actually increase the effectiveness, surely for smoking, but also for cannabis, for example, where you have the same problem, but maybe also for alcohol. We're going to find out.
Thank you. Question? Alors, je vais poser une...
Okay, more questions. I'm going to ask a question to Jean-Luc Martinot.
à ce qu'il évoquait, alors qu'il y a une question un peu...
Regarding what he was mentioning earlier, a more
la réflexion...
generic question. I was thinking... When I listened to your conclusion, I think the microphone is okay. When I listened to your conclusion, I was thinking that these prediction models that you referred to with the use of algorithm are models which may seem like they make sense for a group, for a population. And once we identify protection factors and risk factors, we might use them to influence public health policies. But it looks like they're difficult to use on the individual level. Is it possible to weigh out the protection factors, moderation factors, whereby we can collect data for a single individual and use them in a very personal way, find a very individualized, personalized strategy? And based on what you were saying regarding the weight of the various results, it seems very hypothetical. I'd like to hear from you and whether you think that this may be relevant for public health purposes and for individual cases as well.
J'ai essayé de montrer dans la présentation que...
During my presentation, I tried to point out that research is not a finite product.
C'est-à-dire que là, il y a une nouvelle voie de recherche qui s'ouvre.
There's a new
celle qui applique les algorithmes.
Avenue for research that is opening up now using algorithms. Now, it's been around for some time, but it's been taken up by the media recently, and recently it started providing results that can be interpreted in the field of addiction or mental health.
Donc, comme tout domaine de recherche, je pense qu'un des...
As is always the case when we're dealing with research,
c'est de pas oublier
one of the main qualities
quelque chose de très important.
Lies in not forgetting that doubt plays an essential role.
Éviter d'avoir des politiques de...
Because that's how we will stay away from abrupt mental health policies. I mean, the pandemic experience has shown us precisely that.
Péremptoires peuvent être faites
very
très rapidement.
Authoritative declarations or statements are made, but no one thinks about the data quality, how the data was collected. People just make statements. They don't think about how the analysis was conducted and how the data was collected.
Un peu, on pourrait dire, réaliste, qui est que...
And so if we want to be realistic,
clair, souvent,
we need to come to terms with the fact that for one clear question, there may be complex answers, and it may even lead to more questions.
Il y a quand même une avancée.
On the other hand, I believe that we have made
lorsque les recherches en imagerie, ou même d'ailleurs
progress.
Pas simplement en psychométrie.
Research in the field of imaging and psychometry started approximately 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, we never thought that we had a chance of achieving customized or personalized solutions. Now we know it's not true. If we control the way the data is collected, we can
ou plutôt la façon
single out new risk factors.
Les facteurs de risque interagissent entre eux.
And we find how the risk factors may interact for a given individual.
Montrer que c'est tel facteur.
That way we can show that this or that factor may be more important for that particular person.
Et je crois que c'est tout le travail des recherches actuelles et de se montrer.
That's what we're actually working on right now, and we need to show that it's applicable to real life. Addiction may be a field in which we stand a better chance of actually getting a positive result or answer in the coming years.
Merci beaucoup.
Is that good enough an answer? Well, I believe that we have tools to orient public policies, but I thought that might be one. Another question for not versed.
You show that there's a specific interest of the use of cognitive bias modification in depressed and anxiety patients. And what is the hypothesis behind this? Why do you observe this effect? Because it's really interesting, but a bit intriguing, I guess. I don't know very well the field, but what's your assumption about this?
I think It's because in patients, all the effects that have been found are always in a context where people have an abstinence goal. So abstinence requires a clear reshifting of your choices. And sure enough, after you leave the clinic, you'll be in choice situations at a reception or whatever, where you're either going to drink or smoke or do something else. And then in a way with alcohol, it's relatively easy because you have the non-alcoholic drinks. So I think what happens is that you train this alternative choice, and this is also what patients have reported. So, for example, there was a documentary where they filmed some of the patients, and they also gave examples. Like one example was this German guy had a German clinic where he was in this supermarket with his card, and then going to, have the whole beer section. It's of course big in Germany. So he was heading toward this beer section, and then, suddenly realized where he was going and had the immediate impulse to avoid it now. So this, of course, anecdotal, but I think, these split-second decisions can be very relevant. Another guy at a party, he had been sober for half a year, so he was good. He was at a party, which is, brave. Opens the fridge to take a Coke or something. There's only beer in the fridge. Immediately closes the door. So this is, very close to what you're training, but these are risk situations that do make a difference. And that, well, apparently for some 10% of people did make the difference between remaining abstinent or not. And when we go back to the bigger picture, and that's brain development, first in adolescence, so you get effects on white matter, gray matter of especially early alcohol and drug use. The big question is what happens if you revert after abstinence? And I think, it really differs a little bit per neurocognitive function, but there's quite some evidence for at least partial recovery. But this is also something we should think about because, for example, inhibition. What you see is, on average, a patient with an addiction is less good in inhibition than a control of same education, age, etc. And then he or she abstains for a long time, gets better, but just not quite at the level of the average other person. So then people call it partial recovery. But we don't know if it's partial, because the same factor is actually also a risk factor that comes out over and over again. So it could be this person actually goes to his or her own optimum. So basically we don't know, but we do know the brain is a very flexible organ. So maybe more recovery-based neural recovery is possible than we anticipated. And well, this type of training primarily helps to maintain abstinence, I think. But there's also this other type of training which might also be useful to directly train inhibition, working memory, etc., which might have additional effects, but not so much on abstinence.
Merci beaucoup. Donc il est l'heure maintenant, nous sommes quasiment à l'heure.
Right, it is time, we are on time. Thank you again for Jean-Luc Martinot and Arnaud de Wiers for very interesting presentations, and this is the end of the session. Thank you very much.